All right, thanks for everyone coming on. We have Wang, who is the founder and CEO of Refuge Biopharma. They're doing some really interesting CRISPR technology for cancer treatments. Dr. Wang is a cancer survivor who is passionate about bringing forth smarter medicines that will transform cancer care. He has a bachelor's degree in applied physics, an MBA from Columbia's Business School, and a Ph.D. from Princeton in electrical engineering. Dr. Wang, welcome to the Big Idea Podcast. How are you doing today?
Fantastic. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. So lots going on right now, obviously, in the world with COVID-19 and uncertainty. But you have some amazing technology that you're working on. We have a mutual friend who's your chief scientific officer and president, Dr. Francisco Marancola. And he's been speaking so highly of you, and it's good to see you kind of face to face now, even though it's on Zoom. But tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing in cancer therapy.
Sure, happy to do so. So the core of Refuge is that we have a technology based on synthetic biology, where we take cell membrane receptors and connect it to a type of protein called the DCAS. So a lot of folks are familiar with CRISPR and CRISPR technology. So DCAS is a dead CRISPR system. In other words, the CRISPR no longer cuts the DNA, but it can still be a very efficient delivery vehicle to bring an on and off switch at the protein level or at the genetic level to anywhere in the genome. So in effect, what we can build is a system where we can attach any receptors on the cell surface. And when these receptors senses this respective signal, whether it's, say a tumor antigen, for example, it will actually then release a DCAS, which will go into the cell nucleus and turn off and on any gene we tell it to. So in effect, we're building a master gene switch on the surface of these cells where the cells senses what it's programmed to sense, and then the cells can be programmed to do anything we'd like it to do.
Okay, doesn't it have something to do with CAR Ts as well?
Sure. So CAR T is a type of cell membrane receptors. So, in a typical cell, you could have up to 10 or 100,000 different receptors on the cell surface. So for example, the fact that we can see, smell, and taste, these are all driven by sensors, a type of receptor called the GPCR. Okay, so they're a very specific set of sensors that help us with these various sensory signals. They're receptors that can let the cell know if it's in contact with another cell, or if it's in contact with, say, a bone or extracellular matrix. Their sensors do all these different things. And there's a type of sensors that are on immune cells called TCRs that recognizes, whether a cell belongs in the body or it doesn't belong in the body. For example, if a cell is infected with a bacteria or a virus, then these immune cells will recognize, hey, this cell doesn't belong here, or this cell's infected, we need to get rid of it. CAR T is a type of engineered receptor that is built to recognize tumor antigens, or markers on cell surface that recognize them as tumor cells.
And there's a lot of interesting treatments coming out with CAR Ts. It's kind of been one of the biggest things in the last few years, I guess mostly for leukemias and lymphomas. But solid tumors haven't exactly seen the kind of response that you would in the blood tumors. Why do you think this has a chance of showing response in solid tumors?
That's a very good question. I think let's go back to why this works well with liquid tumors, things like leukemia or lymphoma, is that the therapeutic cells have no problem getting access to the tumor cells, right? They are dispersed throughout the whole body. Solid tumor, the way I like to describe it, and just so you know, my last biology class was in 9th grade. So the way I like to think of a solid tumor is it's kind of like the Death Star. Okay, this is not like gelatin or tofu. It's not a homogeneous material. A solid tumor is actually a complex mass with a lot of things going on there. So for the immune cells to kill a solid tumor, it needs to do three things. And this is, by the way, my best to paraphrase Franco's encyclopedia knowledge of the subject matter. It needs to do three things. First, it needs to recognize the tumor. Second, it needs to penetrate the tumor. And third, once it's inside the tumor, it needs to survive and actually kill the tumor cells. So these are actually three different things. So, using the Death Star analogy, the rebels need to recognize, hey, where's the Death Star? So you need to recognize it. Then two, it needs to get into the Death Star. And then once it get in there, it has to prevent all the Death Star's little cannons from shooting them down, get to the core and blow up the energy source. I mean, that's kind of how a T cell needs to work to kill a solid tumor. And the reason that it hasn't been able to do so is that, right now our people are kind of just solving the first problem. Can it recognize the tumor? And that's what CAR does. It creates a synthetic recognition capability to say, oh, hey, there's these markers on the tumor. I'm going to go find it. But the second and third problem is a little bit more difficult. Is, okay, you see the tumor. How do you actually get in there, right? Again, this is a heterogeneous mass. And once you get in there, how do you get prevented from getting shut down? There's a lot of things that the tumor is doing to survive. And to survive, that means it's shutting down the host's immune system from eradicating it. So our technology, the fact that we can program a T cell to not only recognize the tumor, but the fact that we can turn on and off any gene we tell it to, actually makes it a lot more potent in terms of saying, okay, we recognize the tumor. Is the tumor putting up all these defenses to prevent us from getting in? You know what? So we're going to start turning up and down certain genes to make sure it gets in. And once it's in, is the tumor doing different things to make the T cell more, in a sleep-like state? Do we tell the T cell to convert into other type of cells that's less efficacious, for example? Well, if we know what those are, then we can start turning those genes on and off in a way such that the tumor's defense system doesn't affect the T cells as much.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, in, basic immunology, you have your adaptive immune system and your innate immune system, your adaptive immune system. Your innate is more quick response. Your adaptive is memory. That's why kind of the holy grail in cancer treatment, if you get that memory T cell response, it then remembers what the cancer looks like if it comes back. It has worked amazingly in the blood tumors, or rather the blood cancers, liquid cancers. But yeah, for the solid tumors, it hasn't. So this is basically, and the problem is, it's not recognizing the cancer. Whether it's like self versus non-self model or danger model, you got to get it to recognize it. So your technology, the idea is for it to actually recognize it, attach to it, turn genes on and off to where it's like a little way in. It's like we both train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which we'll get into a little later. Yeah. It's like, you're faking a guard pass, you go one way and they're like, whoop, I'm going the other way. They're going for an arm bar and you thumb down and spin out of it. So is that kind of a reasonable analogy?
I think that's a perfect analogy. One thing I'd like to highlight is even in the liquid tumors, they're saying some of the initial response rate is over 90%, which is amazing, right? Mm-hmm. But what happens is a good number of these patients, whether it's roughly about 40%, after 1 year, there's a relapse. And why does the cancer come back? Well, generally falls into two reasons. One, it's called antigen escape. That means the markers on these tumor cells are no longer expressed. It's just an evolutionary process, right? We give it a therapeutic cell that recognize, every cell that has a tumor marker called CD19. So all those cells are gone. But, tumors evolve. They may have copies of themselves that don't express CD19, and those become actually increased tumor burden. So that's called antigen escape. But another big reason why these therapies stop working after a while is that, the researchers can't find viable T cells in the patient's bloodstream anymore. In other words, T cells are not, after a while they get tired, right? They get tired, they become, I think the term immunologists use it, become in an energy state, and they just don't work anymore. They become less stem-like. So one of the things that you may want to program in these T cells is how do you actually become more stem-like or keep your stem-like status or keep fresh and young over a long period of time. So, and this is actually very pertinent to a number of diseases beyond oncology. You look at COVID-19, for example. the immune system of older people are very different than those of younger people, for example. And among the many mechanisms that attributes to, severe cases, this is one of them, the different immune system between older and younger people. So the idea that you have a more stem-like T cells where you can program genes to have it be more potent over a longer period of time is also necessary to have long-term sustained, cancer eradication.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I was curious why we were seeing those relapses, and I didn't really realize that the T cells could be getting tired per se, like kind of losing the stamina. That's interesting. So you have a passion for helping people with cancer treatments. I mean, you're in this for a very interesting reason. And tell us a little bit about your experience. You were diagnosed with cancer. You've been through it. Tell us about that experience, and what did you learn as a cancer patient that's really helping you now as a pioneer really in this field?
Well, thank you for saying that. So if you could tell from my Death Star and Star Wars analogy, I was the biggest sci-fi dork in the world. So for some reason, at a very early age, I just want to build lasers, and I have no idea why. Maybe just watching too many Star Wars and Star Trek growing up, but I want to make lasers. So I got a degree in applied physics so I can make lasers. So I did. And then I got a Ph.D. in making lasers at Princeton. So I did. I won an award from Princeton for making lasers, And then I spent 3 years actually as a tenure track assistant professor at the University of Connecticut doing lasers. So I was doing that for a very long time. And that for some reason, is just a very nerdy passion of mine. But what happened was, it's funny how all this relates to jiu-jitsu at some point, is that I started training martial art seriously around 1999. Initially with Jeet Kune Do, but Jeet Kune Do they'll do a lot of cross training. So from there I got into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And in middle of 2001, I entered my first and only Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournament, of which I lost in the first round. It was awesome. I was like, oh wow, $40 down the drain for 25. But up until then, I had what I thought was a cyst on my forehead. So I got in that tournament. Again, the first round, I was put in a triangle. I was like, I'm not tapping. I was like 24, 25. $40 is a lot of money back then. And so I said, I'm not tapping this. And the guy eventually let go of the triangle. But I fought that triangle longer than I normally would have. So eventually, he got mount and got me in an armbar. So I tapped. But, you're familiar how a triangle works. Blood goes up to the head. It doesn't come down. So the next day, I looked in the mirror, and what I thought was a cyst on my forehead, which is normally red, it turned black. And I freaked out. So I went to the dermatologist, again, local dermatologist at Princeton. He opened it up. I told him it was a cyst. He said, okay, it looked like a cyst. He opened it up and said, this does not look right. He said, I don't want to actually take it out. So he took a small slice of it, sent it to for a pathology report. And it came back about a week and a half later to be a rare type of sarcoma. So, again, I was 25. And
a sarcoma, for those that are listening, a sarcoma is a form of cancer.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sarcoma is a form of soft tissue tumor. It is malignant. So the school physician at Princeton saw, wow, this is some pretty rare stuff. You're not going to a local hospital. You're going to Memorial Sloan Kettering. So I did a bunch of tests and scans and CTs and MRIs and whatnot. And initially sent me to a dermatology surgery department at Memorial. And the surgeon's like, this is spread too much to your scalp, and you're going to a head and neck doctor. So scheduled for surgery on September 17, 2001. And as you guys know, 9/11 happened. Wow. I couldn't get into Manhattan from New Jersey. I think my surgeon was stuck in, Westchester County, couldn't get into Manhattan. So I was able to schedule surgery last minute at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School on October 3rd. So it was really a 2-week delay. And what's interesting is there's some similarities of 9/11 versus what we're going through right now, is that people actually come together. And when I called up University of Pennsylvania, I told them, I'm a cancer patient trying to get a surgery done at Memorial, couldn't get in Manhattan. They were very, very sympathetic. Usually it takes, more than 2 weeks to get one of these things scheduled, especially, go to a top surgeon in the space, but they were very, very responsive. So, and after that, went through 2 bouts of surgery to remove the tumor, 6 weeks of radiation therapy. And then 2 years later, because of radiation, the skin graft didn't heal. So I had to go through 8 weeks of hyperbaric oxygen treatment. You're not familiar with that is. That's what Michael Jackson used to sleep in every night. You go in a chamber and then they pump it with 100% oxygen, jack up the pressure to 2.5 atmosphere. What happens is it helps the oxygen diffuse better in your microcapillaries and helps with wound healing. So a lot of time people go through radiation and radiation actually damages your microcapillaries. So by jacking up the oxygen, it helps with wound healing. And after that, 2 more rounds of plastic surgery to close they put saline balloons into a good part of my scalp, expanded it over a 5-month period where both balloons are filled with about 500 milliliters of saline. So I basically had 2 big boob implants on my scalp. Then they took out the balloons and took the expanded skin and covered up a lot of the parts that was done by a skin graft. So went through that, 4 surgeries, radiation, hyperbaric oxygen. That was all like from 2001 to 2004. So, but because of that, I become much more passionate. I took my nerdiness around lasers and really start to think of how to apply it towards oncology. And at the time, I couldn't think of any good ideas. I wasn't, like I said, I wasn't a biologist by training, so couldn't come up with much. Wasn't surprising. That's when I decided to move to the business world. Went to business school, but when I left business school, I went to banking, and all of that time was spent in healthcare. Most of that time was spent in life science, actually.
Wow. And so that was 2004 when your last recurrence was?
Well, so that was 2001 when they found the tumor, and they removed it, and it hasn't recurred. The sarcoma's gone because they, even though the tumor is about, size of, tip of my pinky, these tumors have these long tentacles, for lack of a better word, and those actually covered a good chunk of my scalp. But once they removed it, the radiation therapy, it never came back again. However, in 2013, because of the radiation treatment I got in 2001, the radiation caused actually a brain tumor. So I had a benign brain tumor called a meningioma, and that was removed at Stanford. That one, fortunately, it was benign. Although now I have the titanium plate here now, but that was benign. And when I had that was kind of a big motivator for me to start really thinking about, okay, I am looking at biotech companies, I'm looking at healthcare companies with a big focus on oncology, but as a banker, how do I become even more involved? And that was a big motivator for me to try to do something, more operational.
Yeah, now you're into really the most cutting edge because CRISPR is very popular, CAR-Ts are very popular, immunotherapy is very popular. 2011 immunotherapy for cancer won a Nobel Prize. 2018 immunotherapy for cancer won a Nobel Prize. And you're really combining, I might say the highest level of immunotherapy, at least from my perspective, with the CAR-Ts, and then one of the coolest levels of science right now, with the CRISPR, the combination. When I saw Franco working, I'm like, whoa, that's really cool. And what actually gave you the idea to combine those 2 technologies?
Well, I shouldn't take credit for it. I mean, a lot of this was invented by my co-founder. So his name is Stanley Chi. He's assistant professor at Stanford. So he actually got his Ph.D. Under Jennifer Doudna, who was one of the inventors of CRISPR and UC Berkeley. So after he left Doudna's lab and spent 2 years at UCSF, that's where he invented the CRISPR interference technology, or DCAS. So when he got to Stanford, then that was where he combined the DCAS protein with cell memory receptors and created this master gene switch that we're able to do. when he first looked at it, it was still mainly from a bioengineering perspective. And through our conversation, and actually through the conversation with our third co-founder, a gentleman by the name of David Parkinson, then we started to think about applying this immunotherapy in particular for CAR T.
Oh, very, very interesting. Yeah, I look at those technologies and it's very exciting. A lot of people, they've heard of CRISPR technology. I think there's a Netflix documentary out there about it. I forget what it was called, but it's in many ways the future. One of the conversations that we've had is the concern that maybe with all the COVID stuff going on and the issues with the economy, smaller biotechs that are in specific stages might not continue forward, especially companies that are maybe in a phase 1 trial and their trials are halted.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that a little bit. Tell us the landscape of biotech right now and a lot of these cutting edge treatments.
I think, I would say this is a good time to count your blessings. And I would say I am fortunate that we still have cash for, at least through the end of this year. I would say folks that are running bars and restaurants are in a much worse position because we do have, good chunk of cash in our balance sheet, and our business does not require people coming in and then pay us. We don't need to make sales to pay the bills. So I think in that respect, we are fortunate in the grand scheme of things. I think the second part of it is, if you were to look at the fundamental business of what we do, that has not changed. It's not like people are buying less X or less Y, or people buy more toilet paper or more running shoes, who knows? But our business hasn't fundamentally changed. 250,000 Americans will still get lung cancer every year. 240,000 Americans will still get breast cancer every year. That doesn't change. Our science hasn't changed. Our data hasn't changed, and we're still improving on that. So the fundamental, you call it business 101, hasn't changed for most biotech. The number of people getting the disease, the science, none of that has been affected by the virus. Now, what has been affected by the virus are a few other things, mainly around execution. So you brought up a very good point. If as a biotech, usually you raise money to the next value inflection point. So the next value inflection point could be when you get your phase 1 data, when you have recruitment of 20 or 30 people, and you need to show data that these people have responded to treatment. And it takes time. And usually investors give you enough cash to get to that point at which say, okay, I either have the data or I don't, I'm gonna raise cash if I have more data. So let's say a company, not us, but let's say a company that's running a phase 2 study and that need to show that phase 2 study that their drug works before they can raise another round. And the investor goes, okay, well, it takes you 2 years to do your phase 2 study. I'll give you 2 years plus 3 months of cash. Well, given the current environment, a lot of companies are having problem recruiting patients, or especially if you're working on a non-acute indication. So this is a problem for a lot of biotech in that, their cash will get them to the next milestone in a pretty tight window, but the milestone often gets pushed out because of the current environment, and a lot of it just do with patient recruitment, hospital utilization, or just patient getting there. So that's a big problem. For companies a little bit more advanced stage, say companies that, hey, congratulations, FDA approved your drug, now you need to launch your sales, they're also in a tough spot because you need the sales rep to go out and detail these drugs, and it's hard to do that with Zoom. Usually it's hard enough for a sales rep just to get in a doctor's office to say, hey, try my stuff. And what happens is, the patent expiration date doesn't change. You have 20 years for a patent. You spend the first 8 years developing the drug. That means you get to sell this drug for 12 years. Okay. And usually for a company that's launching a drug, it'll take you 2 to 3, maybe 4 years to get to peak market penetration. So if you're missing that commercial launch, or if the commercial launch doesn't go in the right trajectory, that affects your net present value by a meaningful amount. So a lot of these companies maybe are to be already trading in the public markets. So the analysts will discount that relatively quickly. So that's the other part of it. for companies that are a little bit earlier from like us, for example,
Hey, B, I
we're
think there's a
still.
problem with your connection. If I don't know, it got a little spotty there for a second.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, need to find a quiet room. I was hiding from my 4-year-old. This is why I was talking outside.
All good.
Yeah. So, from our perspective, since we're not doing human trials, we're still doing preclinical study, it doesn't affect us as much. Although, I think when we start to ramp up manufacturing, need to make GMP batches of our virus, make GMP batches of our cell, that will get held up like everybody else. At least for us, it shouldn't delay us by more than, I would say a quarter to get to IND. But again, we're dependent on our partners for a lot of this because we're outsourcing a lot of manufacturing, which is quite common in cell therapy.
Or yeah, I guess one of my concerns, just kind of overall, as more of like a human concern, is that we have all this amazing technology getting ready to come out, and I mean, lots of people have put their so much time into these breakthroughs and these amazing ideas, and to have some of the stuff not come forward because of the economy or a disease. I mean, you think about how many lives could be saved with some of these technologies, including yours. And as you said, you're in a better position than many of these companies, but there's still a lot of other technologies that are out there. And, I would just encourage people to realize kind of what's going on with that and still look at investing in these companies, because if things are going down with the economy and we're really trying to help people, investing in things like that in biotech and these smaller biotechs is very important. And a lot of our listeners aren't necessarily investors, but kind of how it works is you have smaller biotechs, you have biotechs that start out with these great ideas. That's where the innovation is. And as they go through the phases, many times they get bought out by the bigger companies. But you got to get them through those phases, those early stages, and that takes investment and it takes money. And so if these things are being delayed, if clinical trials are being delayed because those are more elective in many ways, clinical trials, they're getting held up. And I think it might be it's an unintended consequence of that part of the shutdown, because you don't get those innovations going through.
Absolutely. You're spot on. And I think, this is affecting everybody, but you're absolutely right. One thing about biotech is that, for a lot of companies, they do have a fixed patent life. So everybody's in a rush, in the sprint to speed up development as fast as they can, because, you get 20 years and you take up 15 years to develop a drug, you only sell for 5 years. Investors see that and then they lose interest. So any potential delay that's driven by what we're going through right now will affect, I think, the prospect for a lot of these biotechs.
Yeah, that's another thing I don't think a lot of people realize, is that you do just have a 20-year span to get this thing done. And, people look at drug prices being high, they say, well, why is it so high? Well, if you spend 10 years, 15 years getting a drug through, and, sometimes to get a drug through phase 3, it's going to be $1 billion, or from what I understand, maybe even more. You've got to recover that. Right. That's just how the system works. So, a lot of these companies are in a sprint, and, people can talk about changing the system, and those are fair conversations. But this right now, with the model that we have, you have about 20 years. And so, you knock out a year or two because of COVID-19, which is nobody expected, obviously, or many things. It really affects the innovation that makes such a big human impact.
Absolutely. And one of the standard questions that I ask when I interview scientists to join our team is quite simple. We're working on a therapy that may potentially cost $300,000, because that's the price for cell therapy these days. How do you feel about that? $300,000 buys a lot of mosquito nets, buys a lot of clean water, buys a lot of vitamins, and buy a lot of basic food from many countries around the world. How do you feel about that? So I've gotten a very diverse set of answers. One came from a woman goes, well, I worked in the pediatric oncology world. I can tell you it makes a huge difference to that 4-year-old that had to take care of. I don't think there's a right answer. My best shot at an answer is this, is that, yes, it does cost $300,000 if we succeed. And 2, I can tell you in 20 years from now, this thing is free for all of humanity for the rest of history. Okay. If you're to think about one of the drugs that my co-founder, David Parkinson, helped launch in 2000, is a drug called Gleevec. He was head of Novartis's clinical oncology research, and he was responsible for driving Gleevec to the market. So he was in charge of clinical development. And when Gleevec launched, I remember this was on the cover of Time magazine talking about how expensive the drug was. I can't remember. Maybe it was like $30,000 back in 2000. But this thing will cure a lot of leukemia. Well, Gleevec is off patent now. It's free, effectively free. If you think about the cost it takes to make these things. So I would say that we do create a value. On a temporary basis, we do ask that we provide a return to our investors who are actually taking a lot of risk to invest in any biotech. And we do hope that they get a nice return on their investment, so they don't put money into Facebook or Apple, which are excellent companies generating excellent return. But that's our competition, is these tech companies generate returns. And for the investors to put money in us, we need to show a good return on investment. And by the way, in 20 years, free for all humankind.
Yeah, that's a great way. That's a great way to look at it, for sure. And as the prices are going up right now, with a lot of the different treatments, that is what the market is doing. That's the system that's set up. And a treatment like Gleevec, that's a great example to where it is going off patent, and it is, the price is drastically reduced. And a lot of these therapies that we're seeing, the ones that, like yours, possibly the CRISPRs and those type of things, they have potential to completely change the world, which I'm passionate about. I know, well, you're very, very passionate about. That's your world with your technology. But this to me could be the first time in human history that we have the opportunity to really cure many of the incurable cancers, the solid tumor cancers. If you look back at 1948 or so, the first chemotherapy was made. It was mustard gas, and they treated people with chemo for a long time, but they were doing lymphoma, which is a blood tumor, and they were seeing the response in that, but they expected the same response with solid tumors. It didn't exactly work like that. These immunotherapies, and now combining CRISPR and looking at different ways, really, to me, have giant potential that we've really never seen before. We've seen a paradigm shift in many ways. So I think it's important. I think the more people really understand it from both sides, the general public a lot of times looks at things one way, and they have what they're seeing, and it's good to see a different perspective, not just a different, like your perspective from a biotech with cutting edge technology, with amazing scientists, from someone who's passionate about this, who's lived through a sarcoma brain tumor, basically. It's incredible. And your perspective is a very real perspective, and I hope it gives people hope, because there's a lot of good people in this industry like you. That's another thing that not surprised me, but when I got into this, I didn't know. I mean, I was an old fighter, and I always say, hey, we should build bridges, not walls. How do we work together with top scientists? I started emailing scientists. Hey, what's the study that you got here? Hey, this is interesting here. And you realize that you have a lot in common, no matter what you're doing, if you're really trying to help people. And that's been my experience with biotech, and even big pharma. I know a lot of people from big pharma. There's really great people, but I don't think people really know the process.
Oh, you're spot on. Actually, so a week ago, literally last Friday, I gave a guest lecture to a bioengineering class at Stanford, and the topic was the cell as a computer, synthetic biology application immunotherapy. And the final slide in my talk, I showed a picture of an iPhone. and I took a screenshot of my iPhone. And my point is this, is that you look at this iPhone, right? So Apple makes the actual phone, but actually Apple doesn't make it. Foxconn, does a lot of assembly, and Apple makes their chips with a company in Taiwan called TSMC. Apple designed the chip, but the actual chip is manufactured by Taiwan. The camera on this phone is manufactured by Sony. But you look at the value in this phone. I'm looking at my iPhone. I got Gmail, I got Google, I got Google Photos, for example. I have an app from WeChat. I have an app from WhatsApp, which belongs to Facebook. I have Amazon in there. Each of them are $500 billion, trillion-dollar company. And the fact that they can all work together to have this thing that fits in the palm of my hand or in my pocket drives the tech revolution that we have today. You were to contrast that with the therapeutic space. And this is especially pertinent now in cell therapy, because the idea of what is a drug is fundamentally changed, where we can actually re-engineer entire cells to do so many functions into a single cell. So many big pharma still need to have everything in-house for them to say, I'm going to sell this product. Some of it is driven by FDA regulations. Some of it is just driven by, it's from a strategic and technological perspective, you're just limited by what you have. But I do think to take fully advantage of this revolution that we're coming with CRISPR and the CRISPR derivatives, DCAS, CRISPR interference is a CRISPR derivative. You have base editors and prime editors. That's a CRISPR derivative. These things have the ability to control, interrogate, and manipulate the genome or the human operating system in a way that was previously unfathomable. And then you combine that with application in immunotherapy, among other things, then you really start to see, wow, the cell is kind of like a computer. Well, actually, even better. The cell is kind of like your iPhone, right? It has sensors, the way your phone has sensors, except your cells have a lot more sensors. It has an operating system. The cell has a 3 billion base pair operating system called the human genome. That is actually more powerful than iOS, right? So how do you actually take advantage of that cell and to start to control it the way that an iPhone works? You have software, you have the imagers, you have the manufacturer, all different companies come together, and they're all making money, by the way. None of them are nonprofits. They're all making money. But to come in a way that you have distributed innovation, you have the folks that are really good at making things in the physical sense, do that. You have the folks really good at making innovation, do that, and come together and create a product that fits in your pocket. And for a lot of folks, that is effectively your office. I can work anywhere in the world because of that product. How do we actually get some of that philosophical that's very inherent in the tech industry into the biotech world, into the therapeutic world? I think that's what we need right now.
That's really interesting that you're saying that. And, I was interviewing a medical doctor yesterday who's doing some stem cell therapies. And one of my mentors is the CEO of Stemedica. They've got a really cool stem cell technology. I have another friend who's a brilliant immunologist, top stem cell scientist. And then you had the doctor I was, interviewing the other day. And I was just talking about all these guys. I said, this guy. I said, the reality is, everybody has their technologies, but we all need, and I just want everybody to work together. There's so many good technologies. And I think a lot of times we're in this race to get, something approved or this or that. But in reality, what do we all have in common? We're all humans. We all want people to heal and get better. And, it kind of the old school approach to business is, kind of in many ways win-lose. And I'm like, wait a second, let's do win-win. How do we all win? And I think that mentality is where we kind of need to go to, because we do have so much in common. And how does everybody win? Everybody wins in this when we get all of these technologies out there as safely and fast as possible.
Absolutely. I'll tell you two very interesting questions. One that I asked a buddy of mine, and another question that investor asked me, very similar question. I asked a friend of mine who was super smart, MD, PhD from Harvard, became a radiation oncologist. And I asked him, well, what happens if somebody, come up with a great cancer drug and doesn't need radiation oncology anymore. It's like, that's fantastic. I'm happy to go be in primary care. Like, that's fine. So I used that, and investor asked me this question before. So what happens to your company if somebody comes in and cure cancer? If somebody can cure cancer, I'm happy to work at McDonald's the rest of my life. That is an awesome trade-off. You know what, that is perfectly okay with me. So to your point, this is a business. I am trying to create a return for my investors, but end of the day, this is about human beings, and you're absolutely right in that.
Yeah, it's interesting, to bring the biotech and pharmaceutical field together, like the tech field together. I think it just really, like, conversations like these, I think are important, because I think everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody, but most people are thinking it. We're all thinking like, hey, you know what, we can all get it if everybody's working together towards this big goal. My thing is, I believe everybody working together actually moves forward together. And yes, the ultimate goal is to cure cancer. That's everybody's ultimate goal. And that's, and when that happens, we're all going to celebrate. We really will all celebrate. It's everybody's been affected by cancer that I know of. Obviously, you have personally experienced cancer. I've had family members. I think males are 1 in 3 chance of getting it in their lifetime. Females 1 in 2. So personally, we're all going to. There's all a reasonable chance that we're going to get it. And I mean, this has been going on forever. So these technologies and these ideas of collaboration and working together, I think it's really the future. And I'm actually glad that you're talking about, the relationship to the tech industry and how that was modeled, because that sounds like a good model for cancer therapy.
Absolutely. I think their ability to collaborate and to innovate together, there's a lot of really cutthroat competition there. Don't get me wrong, but somehow they can figure out a way to just create a better product and really make the pie bigger. I think that's the best analogy. Just make a much bigger pie as opposed to a bigger slice. I think that's something that healthcare need to emulate.
Well, it's interesting. Like, one of the things that I find really cool about you is, you started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu back in 1999, I think is what you told me. So you started in 1999. It's 21 years ago. So you're like a complete OG in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And, you've seen that sport evolve. Like, I started around, I think, 97, so close to the same time. And back when we started, it was very, you couldn't train with other people. And this team versus this team, there's still some of that. But it's evolved a lot to where it's not that big of a deal if you're working with other people. And it's, it's that collaboration, and the sport's evolved a lot.
Definitely. I remember, so the school that I trained at, my professor at the time is, a guy named Marco Santos. He was a Machado black belt. So when I moved from New Jersey to Connecticut to start my teaching job there, I felt obligated to find another Machado black belt, and the closest one was out in Providence, Rhode Island. So that was about an hour and 15-minute drive one way from where I live. So I drove that once. It's like, I can't really do that. I just started a new job as an assistant professor. So eventually found a really good school in West Hartford. It was Horace Gracie affiliate. So I trained there during my time teaching at UConn. But I hear what you're saying. At the time, it's important that I train with another, within the Machado network. Now they're much more relaxed.
Yeah. Now it's relaxed a lot. It was funny for those that are watching or listening. So Franco Marancola, Dr. Marancola, had wanted to get us together for a while, and he said, "Oh, he trains." He wasn't sure what it was. I thought, "Oh, maybe he trained karate." And who knows what type of martial arts it was. And it happened to be Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And not only that, he trains with one of my old best friends, Alan Marquez, which is Gumby, who is actually business partners with Scotty, who's my other business partner. But they were business partners in OTM. So it's a really small world.
That's right. So I just given my schedule, I only do private lesson now with a guy named Miggs, who got his black belt from Gumby. So usually we're training 2-3 times a week, from 9:15 p.m. to 10:30 p.m., like 2-3 times a week. And sometimes, I'll see Gumby in there. They're just chilling, hanging out. And it's funny to see Gumby because I saw him when he first opened Heroes Academy back in, I think, 2011, 2012. And it seems like he's one of those few people that get younger with time.
I know, right?
I was like, he actually looks younger after 10 years. And how is that possible?
I don't know. Yeah, especially as long as he's been training, you'd think that he would at least look a little older, but no, he does. Scotty looked that way for a long time too. Scotty, he's 49. He'll be 50 in August. Maybe I shouldn't say that out loud, but he looked really, really young up until he had a back surgery. He had a back surgery. I think it was 2010 or 2011, and I could see he aged a couple of years, or he aged, within a couple of years. I could tell a lot. Maybe it still doesn't look to be, 50 years old. At least that's what I tell him. But he's same type of thing. Gumby and Scotty, they have really good young genes.
Yeah, we need to sequence that and use CRISPR to give everybody a copy.
No, absolutely. Speaking of going back on CRISPR, because I meant to ask this. My another producer for the podcast, buddy JP, his nephew has, it's called Duchenne's. It's a form of muscular dystrophy.
Muscular dystrophy, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a lot of those that have basically one gene off, and I might mess this up because I'm not an expert at this, but he's looking for treatments through CRISPR. Looking at the future, there's a lot of those that just, I don't want to say it's simple, but it's less complicated in many ways. Correct me if I'm wrong. It seems less complicated than cancer. How many of those are out there? And is there kind of a movement to work on the, may I say, more simple ones as well?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert I'm not an expert in oncology, Franco's. That's not my domain, so I can't comment too much on it. But yeah, there's a number of these what called genetic diseases where you literally have one or two single base on the DNA. So DNA is 3 billion base pairs, and some of these diseases are due to the fact that in the gene that encode a very critical function, you have a single base misread, right? So instead of a 1, you have a 0, and vice versa. In DNA, it'd be, you have AGCT, for example, and instead of A, you may have a C as an example. So when that happens, that gene doesn't get transcribed correctly, and you have a protein that doesn't work the way it should. So Duchenne muscular dystrophy is one of these indications. So there are a number of gene therapy approach where they try to replace a copy of that gene, for example. There are other technology that I think it's an improvement on CRISPR. So it's a technology called base editing. It's a CRISPR derivative. So they start with the CRISPR technology, but they're able to just modify a single base in some of these people in the genome in question. And that's a more efficient way to treat some of these genetic diseases.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it's for those that don't know much about CRISPR, in many ways, when they figure all of this out, it really could be the future of medicine, and that's what we have to look forward to in the next 20 years. This is all coming out right now. So with all the COVID stuff coming out, it's really important that we also don't lose sight of these really cutting edge innovations. And there's a lot of sick people out there with a lot of these diseases. And, when all this is said and done, I think it's important, that we support the biotech companies that are working on this stuff and not forget about them, because we have so much progress over the last 10 years.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. And that's exactly the message I think that people should understand. So thank you for saying that and support the industry like that.
Of course. Well, Dr. Wang, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I know that people learned a ton, and I would love to interview you in the future, as your technology moves forward. And if there's anything that we can support you with, please don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Wang.